They say money can bury secrets, but when the truth walks into the room wearing your face, no amount of wealth can buy silence. The air in that courtroom was suffocating, like the walls themselves knew something terrible was about to break. Cameras flashed from every corner, the sound of shutters colliding with the pounding in my chest. I could feel the heat of the lights, the whispers of reporters, the tension building like a storm waiting for lightning to strike. My palms were slick, my suit felt too tight, and yet all I could focus on was him, the man I had called my father for 26 years. The billionaire, the legend, the man who built empires and broke people with a single phone call. He sat there with his head high, chin lifted in that familiar pose of arrogance, pretending to be calm while his lawyers whispered frantic strategies. I had seen that look 1,000 times before, the look he used when he was about to win. But something in me knew he wouldn't win today. The truth was coming for him, and I was the weapon he never saw coming. The judge's gavel slammed down, commanding silence, but nothing could quiet the roaring inside my head. My lawyer leaned toward me, murmuring something about the next witness, but I barely heard him. My eyes kept drifting toward the back of the courtroom. There was a man standing near the last row, motionless, his hands folded, his gaze fixed entirely on me. At first I thought he was just another reporter or spectator drawn by the scandal, but then something strange happened. When our eyes met, I felt it. An invisible punch right to the chest. His face, though older and roughened by years I couldn't imagine, looked familiar. Not in the way you recognize a celebrity or a friend, but familiar in a way that shakes the foundation of who you are. For a second, I forgot to breathe. His eyes were mine. The same shape, the same color, the same quiet sadness. It felt like staring into a version of myself that had lived another life. My lawyer noticed my distraction, whispering, "Are you all right?" But no words came out. My mouth was dry, my body frozen. And then I saw it. The flicker of recognition in my father's eyes as he turned and saw the man too. It was only there for a moment, but I caught it. A split second of panic, fear, and something I had never seen on his face before. Guilt. That was the exact second I understood that whoever this stranger was, my father already knew him, and had spent years making sure I didn't. The man in the back took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling like he was holding back a lifetime of words. The judge asked a question I didn't hear. The courtroom blurred, the air buzzed, and suddenly all the noise vanished into silence. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, leaving only 3 people alive in that room. Me, the man I called my father, and the man who shouldn't have known me at all. Something inside me cracked open. Memories flashed through my head. Nights when my father refused to look at me, the way he flinched when people said I resembled him, the tension between him and my mother that I never understood. It all came rushing back like a flood that had been waiting for years behind a crumbling dam. I stood without realizing it, the legs of my chair scraping against the polished floor. My lawyer grabbed my arm, whispering, "Sit down. Don't make this worse." But my voice, raw and trembling, pushed through every ounce of fear. I wasn't thinking. I was reacting to something deeper than reason. "That's my real dad." The words tore out of me like an explosion. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The echo of my voice hit the walls, bounced off the marble, and fell heavy on every person in that room. Then the chaos began. Reporters gasped, cameras flashed wildly, the judge's gavel cracked against the bench, demanding silence that would never return. My mother, sitting in the second row, covered her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. And my father, the man whose empire touched every corner of this country, just sat there, still as a statue, eyes locked on me, face as white as ash. The man in the back row didn't move. His hands trembled, but his expression was steady. And then, for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes, too. He didn't need to say a word. I already knew. Somehow, I already knew. The judge shouted for order. My lawyer begged me to sit. But I couldn't. Because everything I had ever believed about who I was, every story I'd been told, every lie that built the walls of my life, had just collapsed in a single sentence. My father finally rose from his chair, his voice breaking the silence like a blade. "Sit down now," he said, his tone trembling between fury and desperation. But for once, he wasn't in control. His power, his money, his name, none of it could save him from the truth now standing in the back of that courtroom. The man who looked like me took one cautious step forward, his eyes glistening with everything I'd never been told. And in that instant, I felt something shift inside me. The man I thought was my father wasn't my blood, and the man I thought was a stranger wasn't a stranger at all. The entire courtroom was frozen in disbelief. Every camera lens caught the collapse of a dynasty, every flash documenting the exact second when the richest man in the city lost the one thing he could never buy back. Me. I could hear my own heartbeat again, pounding in my ears, and in that rhythm, I could feel the truth. It wasn't gentle, it didn't heal, it destroyed, and I was standing in its path. But that explosion in the courtroom wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the detonation of a secret 26 years in the making, and I was about to uncover the man who had buried it alive. I thought being a billionaire's son meant having it all, until I realized I had nothing real. I used to believe that wealth could protect me from pain, that as long as our gates were tall, our walls thick, and our bank accounts overflowing, nothing could touch us. That's what it meant to be a billionaire's son, to live untouchable, shielded from the messiness of ordinary life. Our house wasn't a home. It was an empire built on marble and silence. A place where beauty was on display, but truth was locked behind closed doors. Every morning began with the hum of helicopters overhead, the smell of imported coffee drifting through the halls, and the faint echo of my father's voice giving orders through his Bluetooth headset before sunrise. Our mansion stretched across the California coast, 12 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, walls lined with art that probably cost more than most people's entire lives. But despite the luxury, it always felt cold. Everything was spotless, perfectly arranged, and utterly lifeless, as though someone had designed it for a magazine, not for a family. My father's public image was immaculate. To the world, he was a genius. A man who built industries, created jobs, donated millions to charity, and appeared on magazine covers with captions like, "America's Visionary Tycoon." But behind that perfect smile, there was something sharp. At home, he was a storm always waiting to happen. His voice could silence a room faster than thunder. When he walked in, even the staff straightened their backs and lowered their eyes. He didn't hit, didn't scream, but his words cut deeper than any blow could. My mother, on the other hand, was warmth wrapped in fragility. She smiled for every photo, laughed at every event, and stood by his side during every gala, the perfect wife in pearls. But I knew the truth. I heard the muffled cries behind her locked bedroom door. I saw the faint tremor in her hands when she poured tea. She carried secrets she never shared, and the weight of them bent her posture a little more every year. Growing up in that house was like living inside a painting, beautiful from a distance, but hollow up close. We were the perfect American dream family. A father of wealth, a mother of grace, and a son who had everything a child could want. Except love. I had bodyguards instead of friends, tutors instead of teachers, and scheduled family dinners that felt like business meetings. Even as a kid, I felt the distance between us. My father would ask about my grades, my future, my discipline, but never about my dreams. He measured love in performance, affection in achievement. Every conversation was a test, and every smile was a transaction. There were moments, though, fleeting, fragile moments, when I caught glimpses of something human in him, Like the time I fell off my bike and he rushed to pick me up, only to scold me seconds later for not paying attention. Or the night he sat outside my room for hours when I was sick, never coming in, but never leaving either. It was like he wanted to care but didn't know how. Still, I tried. I tried to earn his approval, to fill that unspoken void between us. I studied harder, dressed sharper, learned the business talk before I even understood what it meant. But no matter how hard I tried, his eyes always looked through me, as if he was searching for something that wasn't there. As I grew older, I started noticing the cracks, the way my parents avoided eye contact, the tension that filled the air during family photos, the sudden arguments that ended in silence. I remember one evening, during a dinner party filled with CEOs and politicians, my father made a joke about how I was adopted by ambition. Everyone laughed. My mother didn't. Her hand tightened around her glass so hard that it cracked slightly. That was the first time I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of what his words might reveal. Still, I convinced myself everything was fine. Because when you grow up surrounded by perfection, you learn to ignore the shadows. You tell yourself every bruise on the surface is just reflection, not rot. And I did that for years. From the outside, my life was the picture of privilege. Summers spent on private islands, holidays in Europe, my 16th birthday celebrated with fireworks and champagne. But what I remember most from that night wasn't the music or the party. It was the emptiness that lingered when everyone left. I sat by the pool, staring at my reflection in the water, realizing I didn't know who I was beyond the name I carried. Carter Caldwell, son of billionaire Arthur Caldwell. A name that opened doors, but locked me out of myself. Every time I looked at him, something didn't fit. People said I looked just like my father, but I didn't see it. My eyes, my build, even my expressions felt foreign in the mirror. He was tall and commanding. I was quieter, smaller, and softer around the edges. My mother always brushed it off when I asked. "You have your grandfather's features," she'd say, smiling too quickly. It was meant to comfort me, but instead it deepened the ache of not belonging. I tried to ignore it. I buried the questions under routine, success, and appearances. But you can only silence the truth for so long before it finds a way to scream through the cracks. It started one rainy afternoon, a day so ordinary that I never could have guessed it would become the day that changed everything. I was looking for an old report in my mother's study, a place she rarely let me enter. Her desk smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, drawers filled with neatly folded letters, receipts, and little memories from a life before me. That's when I saw it. A photograph tucked inside an envelope, yellowed with time. I shouldn't have opened it. I shouldn't have looked. But curiosity is cruel when you've spent your whole life surrounded by secrets. I slid the photo out, and my hands went cold the second I saw what was inside. It was my mother holding a baby. Me. But standing next to her was not my father. It was a man I had never seen before, a stranger smiling at the camera with an expression that felt too familiar. My breath hitched, my stomach turned, because somehow I could see myself in him, not just in features, but in spirit. And there, scrawled on the back in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "Chicago, 2001. I stared at them, frozen. Chicago? We'd always lived in California. My father built his empire here. Our whole lives were here. Why would she be in Chicago the year I was born? It didn't make sense. None of it did. But the one thing I knew for sure was that this photograph wasn't supposed to exist. That photo shouldn't have existed, but it held the answer to who I really was. One forgotten photograph can expose 20 years of lies. I remember the day I found it like it happened yesterday. It wasn't a special day. Not at first. The sun was spilling through the windows of our house, turning the marble floors into mirrors, and my mother was out running errands. I was in her study, A room that always smelled faintly of old paper, perfume, and something else I couldn't quite name. My mother didn't like anyone touching her things, but I needed an old report for a family history project. That's how it started. Innocent curiosity. I wish I could say I stopped when I should have, but the truth is, part of me had been looking for something for a long time. I just didn't know what. Her drawers were perfectly organized, each folder labeled in her careful handwriting. Receipts, letters, invitations, medical documents, everything had its place. But one drawer was locked. I'd never noticed it before. The lock was old, the kind that didn't really keep secrets, just tried to. I found a spare key inside her jewelry box and felt a flicker of guilt. But it passed the moment I turned it in the lock and heard the soft click of metal releasing. Inside were things that didn't belong to the rest of her world. Faded photos, ticket stubs, postcards, a few letters tied with a ribbon that had lost its color. It felt like I had opened a time capsule from a life my mother had lived before me. And then I saw it. A photograph, creased at the corners and softened by age. The moment I lifted it, something in me tightened. My breath caught halfway in my throat as I took in the image. It was my mother, younger but unmistakably her, holding a baby wrapped in a white blanket. The sunlight in the picture was warm, soft, and golden. Her smile looked real, not the polite, strained smile I knew from galas and interviews, but genuine, unguarded happiness. But what froze me wasn't her expression. It was the man standing beside her. He was tall, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, his other hand gently touching the baby's tiny head. His smile was calm, confident, and heartbreakingly familiar. The shape of his mouth, the curve of his jaw, the faint dimple near his cheek, all of it mirrored my own face. It was like looking at an older version of myself, someone I didn't know but somehow recognized. My stomach turned. My chest tightened. A strange, cold feeling crept up my spine. I flipped the photo over with trembling hands, and there, written neatly in my mother's handwriting, were the words, Chicago, 2001. Chicago. My entire life, I'd been told I was born in California. My birth certificate, my childhood photos, every family story, they all started in Los Angeles. We didn't have relatives in Chicago. We'd never even talked about it. So why did this picture say otherwise? The questions started piling up in my head, colliding into each other until I couldn't breathe. Who was that man? Why did he look like me? Why had my mother kept this hidden for so long? I sat there staring at the photo, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. It felt wrong, not just suspicious, but forbidden, like I had stumbled onto something sacred and dangerous. Every instinct told me to put it back, lock the drawer, pretend I'd never seen it. But the truth doesn't let go once it finds you. It latches on like fire, spreading faster the more you try to contain it. I waited for her to come home, pacing the hallway, the photo burning in my pocket like evidence of a crime I didn't understand. When I finally heard her keys at the door, I froze. For a few moments, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would sound calm, collected, reasonable. But the second I saw her, every bit of that control evaporated. She walked into the kitchen humming softly, setting her purse on the counter. "You're home early," she said, smiling that soft, practiced smile that had always comforted me as a kid. And that's when I held up the photograph. The smile vanished from her face. Her eyes locked on the image, and in that instant all the color drained from her skin. The bag slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. She stood there for a moment, completely still, as if her body hadn't yet caught up with her mind. Then she whispered, barely audibly, "Where did you find that?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was terrified. I had never heard my mother sound like that. Not even when she argued with my father. This was something deeper, something ancient, as if the truth in that photograph had been haunting her for years. "In your drawer," I said quietly. "Why do you look so scared? Who is he?" She didn't answer. Her hands began to shake. She reached for the photo, but I pulled it back instinctively. I wasn't ready to let it go. I needed answers, and I wasn't leaving without them. "Tell me, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "Who is this man? Why do I look like him? And why does it say Chicago?" She turned away from me, pressing her fingers against her temples like she could squeeze the memories out of her head. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," she murmured, her voice cracking. "This isn't about your things," I snapped. "It's about my life. You told me I was born here. You told me Dad was there when I was born. Were you lying to me?" She spun around, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time, she didn't look like the composed woman I'd grown up with. She looked broken, fragile, human. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered. Her words echoed through the kitchen, soft yet shattering. The air between us thickened with silence. I wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe, because the look in her eyes told me that whatever she was about to say next, whatever secret that photograph carried, would change everything I thought I knew about our family, and about myself. And what she said next would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Every lie has a heartbeat, and I could hear hers breaking. When I demanded the truth, my mother didn't answer with anger or deflection. She answered with the kind of silence that arrives before a storm, the kind that makes the walls hold their breath. For a long moment she simply stood there, the photograph clutched in her fingers, and I watched a woman I had always seen as composed unravel in real time. Her hands trembled so badly that the image quivered, the edges of the paper catching the light like a fragile confession. In that suspended instant, I realized I had been wrong to think secrets could be kept without consequences, because the person who had been carrying the heaviest burden was the one I loved most, and the burden had finally become too much for her to bear alone. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, as if the floor beneath her had given way, and the color drained from her face in waves. Her voice came out small at first, so quiet I had to lean in to hear it. Then it built into a trembling honesty that left no room for the polite deceptions she had always wrapped herself in. She told me about him, about a man she had loved before my father existed in her life, a man whose name she had never allowed herself to say aloud in our home, because saying it would be like opening a wound she had vowed never to touch. Her words flowed in a rush, memories spilling out of her like water through a cracked dam. Late nights in cheap apartments, conversations about futures that never happened, promises that had been broken, and a fear that grew when she met my father and saw how different his world was from theirs. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were red-rimmed and raw, and she used a voice I had never heard her use before, the voice of someone confessing a betrayal not only against herself, but against the life she had built with another man. "He was your real father," she said, and the syllables dropped like stones into a still pool, the ripples of that single declaration reaching further than either of us expected. The room seemed to tilt. The familiar contours of my childhood blurred and shifted into something strange and unstable. For the first time I understood that the picture I had found was not an accident or a careless keepsake. It was evidence of a life she had been forced to erase, a life that had once been possible and had been taken from her by choices she never wanted to make. She told me how the day I was born changed everything. My father had learned of the other man's existence, and the way she described his reaction was not the grand fury people imagine when they hear about betrayal, but a cold, meticulous control that frightened her more than any outburst could have. He didn't yell, he negotiated. He did not storm out. He rearranged realities. In the weeks after I was born, she said, the man who had loved her and the man who would become my legal father had entered an arrangement where silence was the only currency that mattered. My mother's voice broke as she explained how my real father had been paid or promised to disappear, how documents had been altered, how phone calls had been intercepted, and how, most painfully, she had been instructed to never tell me the truth. Every detail she revealed tightened the knot inside my chest until I felt suffocated by the architecture of their lies. There was a tremor of shame in the way she recalled being complicit, not because she had wanted to hide me, but because she had feared what losing safety would mean for both of us. My mother spoke of threats whispered behind closed doors, of legal pressure that arrived like vultures circling a wounded animal, and of an unspoken ultimatum that left her no choice but to comply. She admitted that she had been terrified for me, for herself, and for anyone who might cross my father's path. The confession came with apologies that felt like they were meant to heal her as much as they were meant to absolve me, and I found myself listening to each one like a man cataloging new wounds rather than receiving solace. Before I could process the cascade of revelations, the front door opened, and my father walked into the kitchen as if he hadn't been listening to a single word, though in his eyes there was a flicker of something urgent and familiar, a fear he thought he had buried. He moved with the calm efficiency of a man used to solving problems with resources rather than empathy, and in one decisive motion he reached for the photograph in my mother's hand. There was no argument, only a ruthless certainty as he crumpled the paper and shoved it into the trash can, his fingers efficient and surgical, as if erasing the image would erase the implication it carried. Then he shredded what remained with a businesslike fury that was chilling in its normalcy. "Forget what you saw," he demanded, every syllable stripped of warmth. The command was not a plea. It was an order from a man, convinced that the world could be managed if he was the one writing the rules. But the photograph had already lodged inside my head like a splinter, and no amount of shredding could remove it. I watched the little scraps of printed truth fall like snow into the bin, and felt, for the first time, an internal division so violent it split my understanding of family in two. The man who had so carefully built a life around power had underestimated the single stubborn fact that truth, once unearthed, resists being buried again. Even as he stood there, composed and dangerous, I felt something in me shift from obedience to resolve. Something that had been trained to respect his authority now readied itself to defy it. When the fragments settled into the trash, their edges bleeding into nothing, I understood the choice I faced. My father could shred paper and buy silence, but he could not shred memory, erase blood, or rewrite the past that had led me to this kitchen with a photograph burning holes in my pocket. The room smelled faintly of coffee and fear, and I knew in the marrow of my bones that if he wanted the truth buried, I would dig it up myself, no matter how deep he tried to hide it. If he wanted the truth buried, I was going to dig up the grave myself. I wasn't just searching for a man. I was searching for who I really was. After that day in the kitchen, nothing felt solid anymore. Every photograph in the house looked like evidence. Every conversation sounded rehearsed, and every smile felt like part of a carefully managed illusion. My mother tried to pretend that life was normal, but the air around us had changed. Even the walls seemed to carry guilt. I couldn't shake the thought that the person I called my father had designed my entire existence like one of his business ventures, acquired, packaged, and sealed away under a false name. I spent weeks moving through my life as a stranger. I attended company dinners, smiled when cameras flashed, played the role of the billionaire's perfect son. But behind that mask, I was already drifting away. Every night, I sat in my room replaying my mother's confession, the sound of her voice fracturing under the weight of a truth she'd carried alone. I knew she'd told me everything she could, but I needed proof. Something beyond words and faded memories. I needed facts, documents, records, anything that would confirm who I truly was. That's when I decided to hire someone. I didn't go to my father's legal team or his private security firm. Those people worked for him, not for me. Instead, I contacted a small investigative agency on the outskirts of the city, one that specialized in cases most clients wanted kept off the books. The man I met there, Frank Turner, wasn't what I expected. He was old school, gray hair, leather jacket, a cigarette tucked behind his ear, and eyes that had seen too many lies to be impressed by mine. When I told him what I was looking for, he studied me for a long time before he spoke. "You sure you want to dig in this grave, kid? Because once you start, there's no turning back." "I don't need turning back," I said quietly. "I need the truth." He nodded once and opened a fresh notebook. That was the beginning of our search. The first trail he followed was my mother's history. She'd told me bits of her past, but everything before her marriage was vague, almost scripted. Within a week, Frank found her old travel records. There it was, black and white, a 3-month stay in Chicago during the year I was born. The dates didn't match the story she and my father had always told. According to every family album, my first months were spent in Los Angeles. Yet here was proof that my mother had been living in another city entirely, and not just visiting. Frank looked at me over his glasses. "Chicago, huh? That's a long way from the California coast. You think your old man knew about this?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We both knew the answer already. From there, we tracked hospital records. It wasn't easy. My father had influence in every major institution across the state, and files had a way of disappearing when his name came up. But Frank was patient, relentless. 2 weeks later, he slid a manila folder across my table. Inside was a copy of a birth certificate, my birth certificate, but it wasn't the same one I'd grown up seeing. The date and mother's name matched, but the father's section was blank. And scribbled across the top corner was a note written in old typewriter ink. "Temporary name change. Pending confirmation." My stomach twisted as I stared at the paper. I could almost feel the weight of the pen that had erased a man from my existence. Temporary, it said. But somehow that temporary lie had lasted 26 years. Frank kept digging. He called in favors, reached out to old courthouse contacts, searched microfilm archives from the early 2000s. A month passed before he found something that changed everything. There was a sealed court file dated 2 months after my birth, labeled paternity dispute, confidential. He couldn't access it directly. Those records were sealed under my father's company's legal authority, but the title alone was enough to make my hands tremble. "Kid," Frank said, leaning back in his chair, "whatever this is, it's bigger than you think. You don't hide paperwork like that unless someone powerful wants it gone." I nodded, staring at the folder as if it might open by itself. My entire life was suddenly reduced to ink, stamps, and signatures. My name, my identity, my history, all manufactured, all approved by the man sitting across the dinner table every night. The next step was obvious but terrifying. DNA. Frank hesitated when I told him what I wanted. "If your father's who you say he is, he's not going to let you test that easily. The moment a lab processes your sample, he'll know." "Then we don't let him know," I said. "We do it privately." He studied me for a long moment and then sighed. "All right. But once that result comes back, your life won't be the same. You sure you're ready for that?" I thought about my mother's tears, the shredded photograph, the hollow sound of my father's voice ordering me to forget. "I've been ready my whole life," I said. We used a private genetics lab in Seattle, one that handled confidential testing for high-profile clients. I mailed the samples myself under a false name, using a prepaid account Frank had set up. The process would take 2 weeks. Those 14 days were the longest of my life. I pretended to live normally. I went to business meetings with my father, smiled through conversations, listened to him talk about company mergers and stock growth, as if we were just 2 men discussing strategy. But every time he spoke, I saw something different now. A lie beneath every syllable, a story carefully maintained to keep me blind. My mother avoided eye contact with both of us. She moved through the house like a ghost, her silence saying everything words couldn't. When the results finally came in, I was alone. The email arrived late at night, the screen glowing against the darkness of my room. My hands shook so badly I could barely click the message open. Frank had warned me not to look until I was ready. But there's no such thing as ready when you're about to dismantle your own identity. The document was simple. Black text on a white page. 2 lines were all it took to destroy everything I thought I knew. Paternal relationship excluded. Probability of paternity 0%. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My eyes blurred, my heart thudded painfully in my chest, and the silence in my room became deafening. My father wasn't my father. The man who raised me, who taught me how to tie a tie, who controlled every step of my life, was nothing but a stranger pretending at blood. Frank called 5 minutes later. "You got the results?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah." He was quiet for a beat, then said softly, "Kid, I'm sorry. But if your old man hid this, he's not going to let it stay hidden. You've just opened a door you can't close." "I don't care," I said, my voice cracking. "He's taken enough from me already. I just want to know who my real father is." Frank sighed. "Then brace yourself. Because if this guy's powerful enough to rewrite your birth, he's powerful enough to erase the man who gave it to you." The DNA results that came next didn't just shock me, they broke me. A few drops of saliva, and my entire life dissolved before my eyes. The email came just after midnight. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that only exists when the world outside has gone to sleep, but your mind refuses to. I sat at my desk, staring at the laptop screen, the glow of it painting the room in a cold, artificial light. It had been 2 weeks since I mailed the DNA sample under a fake name. 2 weeks of sleepless nights and anxious pacing. 2 weeks of pretending that my life hadn't already begun to unravel. I'd told myself that no matter what the results said, at least I would know the truth. But as I hovered my cursor over the message from the lab, I realized that knowledge doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it burns. My hands trembled as I clicked open the email. It wasn't long, just a few lines of sterile, scientific language, but it felt like reading the obituary of my own identity. Paternal relationship excluded. Probability of paternity 0%. The words didn't make sense at first, as if my brain refused to translate them. I read them again, and again. Each repetition carved a deeper wound. My breath caught in my throat. My father, the man whose shadow I had lived under my entire life, whose approval I had chased like sunlight, was not my father. 26 years of family dinners, birthdays, achievements, every hug, every harsh lesson, every look of disappointment, all of it suddenly belonged to a lie. I stood so fast the chair behind me crashed to the floor. My body moved before my mind did. I stumbled out of my room and out onto the balcony, gasping for air as if the walls inside had been choking me. The cold night air hit my lungs, sharp and merciless. The world below was asleep, unaware that mine had just collapsed. My hands clutched the railing as tears blurred my vision. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I had grown up believing I was the son of a giant, the heir to an empire. But what was I now? A mistake? A secret? A child who had been purchased instead of loved? The city lights below me shimmered like reflections on broken glass. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing on my chest, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know who I was. I felt like I was watching the ghost of my own life from the outside. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, and all I could think was, why didn't anyone tell me? I don't know how long I stood there before I finally went downstairs. My mother was in the living room, still awake, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea that had gone cold in her hands. She looked up when she heard me, and the moment our eyes met, she knew. She didn't need to ask what the email said. She saw the truth written all over my face. I didn't say a word at first. I just handed her my phone, the screen still glowing with the results. Her fingers trembled as she read, And when she finally looked back at me, the tears had already begun to fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the word. "I should have told you years ago. I wanted to. I tried. But he wouldn't let me. He said if I ever told you, he'd take you away from me. I thought I was protecting you." I wanted to yell, to ask her how protecting me could mean lying to me for my entire life. But when I saw the way her shoulders shook, the words died in my throat. She had been a prisoner in her own life, too, chained by the same man who had controlled mine. I sat down beside her, and for the first time since I was a child, she reached for my hand. "He found out about Mark before you were born," she said, her eyes distant, reliving memories that still hurt to touch. "He gave me a choice, either stay and never speak of it again, or lose everything. I was young, scared, and stupid. I thought I could build a normal life for you. I thought if I pretended long enough, the lie would become true." Her confession poured out between sobs, words tripping over each other like she'd been waiting decades to let them out. "I loved him," she said. "Your real father. His name is Mark Reynolds. He wasn't rich, but he was kind. He wanted to be in your life, but Arthur made sure that never happened. He had the power to erase people, and he did." I stared at her through tears that I didn't remember starting. The name, Mark Reynolds, echoed in my head like an unfinished melody. It didn't feel real yet, but something about it stirred a memory buried deep in my childhood. A name I'd overheard once in an argument between my parents. I hadn't understood it then, but now it made sense. Everything did. "He's alive?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She nodded. "Last I heard, yes. Arthur paid him off and threatened him. But he's out there somewhere. He never wanted to leave." The pain in her eyes was unbearable, and I had to look away. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint hum of the ocean outside. Finally, I stood and wiped my face, though the tears kept coming. "I need to find him," I said. She looked terrified. "If Arthur finds out you're looking, he'll—" "I don't care." My voice was shaking, but there was something steady underneath it. Resolve. I've lived my whole life as someone else's son. I deserve to know who I really am. She reached for me again, but I stepped back. I couldn't stay there any longer. The house that once felt like a fortress now felt like a cage built from lies. Every wall, every portrait, every memory whispered the same question. Who are you, really? That night, I packed a small bag and left. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending. The truth had already found me. Now I had to follow it. I checked my phone before getting into my car, half expecting to see a message from my father, but the screen was blank. No call, no text. Just the emptiness that comes after an earthquake, when the dust hasn't yet settled, but the destruction is already done. And that's when I saw the black car parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, engine idling. The headlights flicked on for a split second, then off again. My pulse quickened. I didn't need to see the driver to know who sent them. But before I could confront my father, his lawyers came knocking. Power doesn't beg, it silences. The knock on my door came early in the morning, sharp and deliberate, the kind of sound that doesn't ask permission. It announces control. I opened it to find two men in black suits standing on the porch. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Everything about them, the tailored suits, the blank expressions, the silence between their words, told me they worked for my father. One carried a leather briefcase polished so perfectly it reflected the morning light. The other held a thick envelope sealed with my father's corporate insignia. The sight of that logo, the same one I'd grown up seeing on building walls, luxury cars, and news headlines, made my stomach twist. "Mr. Caldwell," one of them said smoothly, though his tone made it sound less like respect and more like a reminder. "We're here on behalf of your father. May we come in?" I didn't answer right away. I should have closed the door. I should have told them to leave. But curiosity and anger make strange partners. I stepped aside, and they entered without hesitation, the smell of their expensive cologne mingling with the scent of the coffee I hadn't yet finished. They moved through my apartment like they owned it, like they were inspecting property they already planned to repossess. The taller one placed the briefcase on my dining table, clicked it open, and pulled out a folder so thick it looked like it contained an entire lifetime. "This is a confidentiality agreement," he said, flipping it open to the last page. "And this," he pulled out a crisp check, "is a gesture of goodwill, $5 million. Sign the agreement, deposit the check, and this entire matter disappears. No press, no courts, no complications." I stared at the check. $5 million. Enough to change anyone's life. Enough to buy freedom. But only if you define freedom as silence. "You think money fixes everything?" I asked quietly. The shorter man smiled faintly, like he'd heard that question 100 times before. "Money doesn't fix everything," he said. "It prevents worse things." I laughed bitterly. "Worse things? Like the truth?" The smile vanished. The taller one spoke again, his voice turning firm. "Your father has built a legacy that affects thousands of people, employees, investors, families. If this story gets out, it won't just destroy him, it'll destroy everyone connected to him. Do you really want that on your conscience?" I looked at the papers spread across my table, the cold precision of legal language designed to bury reality beneath ink and signatures. My father's name was on every page. His world was a fortress built out of contracts, and this was just another wall meant to keep the truth from escaping. $5 million, I repeated slowly, my hand brushing the edge of the check. The weight of that number pressed against me. I could almost hear his voice behind it, that familiar tone that always mixed disappointment with authority. "Take the deal. Be smart. Don't be emotional." For a moment, I almost did. It would have been so easy to sign my name, cash the check, and pretend none of this ever happened. But then I thought of my mother. The years she'd spent carrying secrets too heavy for one person to hold. I thought of the man in Chicago who might still be waiting. The man who had been erased so my father could play God. I thought of myself. A son without a name. A life written by another man's lies. I looked up at the two men. Tell him I said no. They didn't react immediately, just exchanged a glance that carried 1,000 silent calculations. The taller one sighed, closing the briefcase with a metallic snap. "You should think about what you're doing," he said. "There won't be another offer." "Then it's a good thing I don't need one," I replied. He slid the check toward me anyway, as if leaving temptation behind. "Keep it. Maybe you'll change your mind." When they left, the apartment felt smaller, suffocating under the echo of their footsteps. I picked up the check, stared at the elegant handwriting, the neat signature, the empty promise. Then I tore it in half, slowly, deliberately, watching the pieces flutter to the floor like broken wings. That night, the phone rang. I knew who it was before I even looked. The caller ID just confirmed what my gut already felt. My father. I hesitated before answering, my hand shaking slightly. The second I picked up, his voice cut through, calm, measured, but colder than I'd ever heard it. "You had your chance," he said. "You could have walked away quietly, with your dignity and your future intact." "I don't want your money," I said. "I want the truth." There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his tone changed, softer, almost venomous. "You're not my son. You never were." The words landed like a blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to yell, to say something, but he didn't give me the chance. "From this moment on," he continued, "you're cut off. No more trust fund, no more family name. You're nothing to me. Do you understand?" My voice cracked, but I forced the words out. "I understand perfectly." The line went dead. I sat there staring at the phone, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was absolute, the kind of silence that fills a space after an explosion, when all you can do is listen to the pieces settle. He thought cutting me off would end it. He thought fear would make me crawl back. But he had underestimated something he'd never understood. The moment you have nothing left to lose, you stop being afraid. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote down every detail, every memory, every clue that could lead me to my real father. If Arthur Caldwell wanted silence, I'd give him noise, in the one place even he couldn't control. If he wanted silence, I'd make him hear the truth. In court. When the truth goes to trial, everyone bleeds. Filing the case felt like dropping a match into a room soaked with gasoline. The world caught fire overnight. Within hours of the court clerk stamping the documents, my name was everywhere. Television anchors, talk shows, gossip sites, business columns. Billionaire's son sues for truth. The headline spread like a virus. Some called me brave. Most called me insane. But none of them understood what it felt like to stand alone against a man who owned everything, the media, the law, and the narrative. I hadn't wanted it to become public, but with my father, nothing stayed quiet. His legal team moved faster than wildfire. Within 24 hours, they filed a counterclaim accusing me of defamation and emotional harassment. They painted me as a spoiled heir throwing a tantrum to get attention. On social media, strangers called me the ungrateful son, the entitled child, the traitor. I watched my name trend beside his company's logo, as if we were products in competition instead of blood in conflict. My mother refused to testify. I couldn't blame her. Fear had shaped her life for too long. When I begged her to stand with me, she shook her head, tears in her eyes. "You don't know what he's capable of," she whispered. But I did. I'd lived it. And I wasn't going to let fear silence me the way it had silenced her. The first day in court felt like walking into a movie where I was both the villain and the victim. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as I climbed the stairs, my lawyer shielding me from the questions that flew like daggers. Are you after the inheritance? Are you mentally stable? Do you regret this? I ignored them all. My father had crafted his public image so carefully that anyone who challenged him automatically looked corrupt. I wasn't just fighting for truth, I was fighting for the right to exist outside his shadow. Inside, the courtroom was cold and bright. The judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, presided from the bench with an expression that revealed nothing. My father sat across the aisle, perfectly composed in his custom navy suit, surrounded by a small army of lawyers. He looked up at me once, and in that glance, I saw the same power he used to command boardrooms and governments. But underneath it, for just a flicker, I saw something else. Contempt. He didn't see a son. He saw a problem to eliminate. His lead attorney, a man named Jeffries, opened with a speech so polished it could have been written for television. "This case," he said, "isn't about truth. It's about greed. The greed of a young man who cannot accept that his father's success is greater than his own." He gestured toward me, his voice dripping with condescension. He was raised with every advantage, and now, instead of gratitude, he gives us betrayal. Every word hit like a slap, but I stayed still, because losing composure was exactly what they wanted. My lawyer, a woman named Clara, countered with calm precision. She spoke about integrity, about evidence, about the right to know one's origin. "This case isn't about wealth," she said firmly. "It's about truth, a truth that's been suppressed for 26 years. The courtroom murmured. I caught my father's faint smirk. He wasn't worried. He thought he had already won. After all, he owned half the people sitting in that room. Over the following days, his lawyers buried us in paperwork, endless motions, objections, and procedural delays. They used every trick in the book to exhaust us before we even began. They leaked selective information to the press, twisting facts until the story looked like fiction. They even found witnesses, Former employees who claimed my mother had fabricated everything to extort money. At night, I'd go home to find reporters camped outside my apartment building, their camera flashes bursting through the darkness. Every time I stepped outside, microphones crowded my face. Do you hate your father? Are you lying for attention? The narrative was slipping away from me, and I could feel it. But beneath the exhaustion and humiliation, there was something stronger. Determination. Because the truth wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every version of me that my father had silenced over the years. The little boy who didn't understand his father's coldness. The teenager who couldn't explain why his mother always looked afraid. The man who found a photograph that tore open a buried world. When the day finally came for me to testify, the room was packed to capacity. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists filled their pages, and the judge warned the crowd that interruptions would not be tolerated. As I took the stand, my father leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, watching me like a predator waiting for his prey to stumble. My lawyer began gently, asking me to recount my discovery of the photograph, my mother's confession, the DNA test. I spoke slowly, clearly, trying to keep my voice from breaking. Every sentence felt like tearing a scar open. When she presented the test results to the court, a hush fell over the room. My father's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. Jeffries stood and began his cross-examination. His tone was smooth, but every question carried venom. Isn't it true, Mr. Caldwell, that you've been under emotional distress recently? Isn't it true that you feel resentment toward your father? Isn't it true that this so-called DNA test could have been tampered with? I answered calmly at first, but the pressure was relentless. You're suggesting I forged a lab result? I said. I'm suggesting, he replied, that people say a lot of things when they want attention. My lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury looked uncertain. The judge overruled, and Jeffries sat down with a self-satisfied smirk. It felt like the walls were closing in. I could feel the weight of every camera lens, every whisper, every doubt filling the air. My father leaned back, that faint smile still on his face. He thought it was over. The judge cleared her throat, ready to dismiss the session for the day. My lawyer was about to gather her papers when the courtroom doors creaked open. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway, older, weary, but unmistakably familiar. My heart stopped. My breath caught in my chest. The world around me blurred as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. He looked straight at me, his eyes wide with emotion. And in that instant, I knew. The same man from that old photograph. And my life stopped. Sometimes a stranger's face feels more familiar than your own. When he stepped forward, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. For a second, no one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the very air inside those walls recognized him before I did. The man was older than the photograph I'd found. Lines carved into his face like the map of a hard life, hair streaked with gray, clothes plain but clean. Yet behind the wear, behind the exhaustion of years, there was something I couldn't ignore. His eyes. The same gray as mine, the same depth, the same reflection that had haunted every mirror I'd ever looked into. I'm Mark Reynolds, he said quietly, his voice trembling but steady enough to cut through the murmurs. The name hit me like a jolt. I had read it on hospital records, whispered it in my head 1,000 times since my mother's confession. Seeing the man behind the name felt like a dream I wasn't ready to wake from. My lawyer turned, startled. The judge frowned. My father's attorney immediately stood, objecting, shouting about unauthorized witnesses and irrelevant testimony. But the judge raised a hand, silencing them. Something in her expression softened, like even she understood the weight of what was unfolding. Mark walked toward the witness stand, clutching a worn folder in one hand and a stack of yellowed envelopes in the other. His fingers trembled as he placed them on the table, his eyes flicking to me, then to my mother. The room was so silent I could hear the faint click of the clock on the far wall. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he began, voice breaking slightly. "I'm here because I've been waiting 20 years to be heard." He turned toward the judge, his shoulders straightening with quiet determination. "Your Honor, I have documents that were never supposed to exist. Any more. Letters, records, and correspondence that prove who I am. And I believe they prove that this young man," he gestured toward me, "is my son." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. I felt my throat tighten, my heart pounding so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. My lawyer rose to her feet, asking the judge to let him speak. After a long pause, the judge nodded. Mark unfolded the first envelope and pulled out a letter written in neat, careful handwriting that time had faded but not erased. He explained that he had written dozens of these letters, birthday messages, holiday cards, simple notes saying he loved me. All of them had been mailed to our family home, and all of them had been intercepted before they ever reached me. "I didn't disappear by choice," he said. "I was made to disappear." He went on to tell the court how, after my birth, my father's legal team had approached him. They had offered him money, an amount that, at the time, felt impossible to refuse. "They told me if I ever tried to contact my son again, they would destroy me," he said, voice thick with shame. "I took the money because I thought it would keep them from hurting your mother. I thought I could come back later when things were safe. But by then, every door had been closed, every record sealed. I wrote for years, hoping something would slip through. It never did." My eyes blurred with tears. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Every word he spoke felt like a piece of my life being returned to me, missing fragments of a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd been trying to solve since I was a child. He reached for the last letter in the pile. It was unopened, the envelope still sealed. "This was the one I wrote on your 18th birthday," he said softly. "I didn't have an address anymore. I just kept it." His hand shook as he extended it toward me. "Son, I've been waiting for this day for a very long time." My throat closed. I took the letter from him, my fingers brushing his for the first time. It was such a small contact, but it felt like the world shifted on its axis. I saw my mother in the front row, her face wet with tears. She had both hands over her mouth, as if holding back years of guilt and relief. My father, sitting stiff across the room, clenched his jaw so tightly the muscle twitched near his temple. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every person in that courtroom, the judge, the lawyers, the journalists, was watching a dynasty collapse in real time. The story the world had believed for decades was cracking open. The billionaire's spotless legacy was bleeding truth, and there was no way to stop it. For a moment, all I could do was stare at Mark Reynolds, my real father, and try to remember how to breathe. He wasn't what I had imagined. He wasn't the hero of my childhood fantasies. He was just a man, tired, flawed, and very human. But for the first time in my life, I felt something I'd never felt before. Recognition. The judge finally broke the silence. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "you'll submit those letters into evidence. We'll review their authenticity." Mark nodded, his eyes still fixed on me. "That's all I wanted," he said, "for the truth to finally be seen." But before I could even speak, before I could thank him or ask him 1,000 questions that had been burning inside me since I found that photograph, my father's lead attorney stood again. His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, this is a stunt. This man is an imposter seeking attention and financial gain." The tension snapped like a live wire. I saw my father lean in, whispering something to his attorney, his expression hard as steel. The man nodded and began gathering his papers, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. Whatever my father was planning next, it wasn't surrender. I turned toward him, and our eyes met across the courtroom, a silent war between power and truth. He looked calm, almost satisfied, and in that instant I realized he wasn't finished. Not even close. But my billionaire father wasn't done. He still had one more weapon left. When truth fails, power fabricates. The morning after Mark Reynolds took the stand, the entire country seemed to have an opinion about me. Overnight, the headlines twisted from "Billionaire's son fights for the truth" to "The fraudulent heir." The shift was orchestrated, deliberate, and undeniably effective. My father's PR machine didn't just counterattack, it detonated. The story that had once been about a family secret was now a spectacle of scandal, designed to bury me beneath the weight of public humiliation. I woke up to find reporters camped outside my building again, their voices merging into a single, chaotic hum of accusation. My phone vibrated non-stop. Messages from people I thought were friends, colleagues from the firm where I'd worked, even strangers telling me I was ungrateful, that I was ruining a good man's name. My employer called to temporarily suspend me while they reviewed the media coverage. My bank account was frozen, my apartment security hacked, my private messages leaked. Every corner of my life was being dismantled by the same man who had built it. When I walked into the courtroom that day, I was no longer the sympathetic son. I was the villain in a story my father's lawyers had rewritten overnight. He sat there at his usual place, calm and confident, the corners of his mouth hinting at the faintest smile. He didn't need to look at me to win. His power was already doing it for him. Then came the blow. His lead attorney, Jeffries, rose with a stack of folders and handed copies to the court. "Your Honor," he said, "new evidence has surfaced. Documents that challenge the credibility of Mr. Reynolds' claim." The judge nodded, motioning for him to continue. Jeffries opened the folder and held up several pages. "These," he said, "are DNA results from a certified lab showing that there is no genetic relationship between Mr. Reynolds and the plaintiff." He turned to face the cameras, to the journalists scribbling in their notebooks, and then looked right at me. In fact, this new evidence strongly suggests that Mr. Reynolds and the plaintiff conspired to fabricate earlier results for financial gain. The courtroom erupted into whispers. My lawyer jumped to her feet, demanding to see the documents, but the damage was already done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and my father knew it. I stared at the so-called results, my stomach twisting. Even before examining them, I knew what they were: a forgery. My father's empire wasn't built on truth. It was built on control, on his ability to twist reality until people couldn't tell the difference anymore. If truth was fragile, he had learned long ago how to break it and sell the pieces. By the time court adjourned for the day, every news outlet was running with the story. Fake DNA results expose Billionaire's son. Reynolds' claim crumbles under new evidence. Within 24 hours, my reputation was ash. People I had known for years stopped returning my calls. My lawyer warned me to stay inside. The paparazzi had started following her car, too. Even my neighbors avoided me. I was radioactive, untouchable in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. I remember standing by the window that night, watching the city glow beneath me, thinking how fast power could erase a person. I had always known my father was ruthless, but this was something different. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was erasing me, rewriting my existence as if I had never mattered. The next day in court, I almost didn't show up. My lawyer had to come to my apartment and drag me out of bed. "You can't let him win," she said. "He's counting on you to break." Her words rattled around in my head as I walked into the courtroom, numb, hollow, my hope hanging by a thread. And then, something happened that I hadn't expected. As the session began, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, quietly, almost timidly. I turned and froze. My mother walked in. She looked different, older, smaller somehow, like the truth had weighed her down. But there was determination in her eyes I'd never seen before. She ignored the gasps and whispers as she walked down the aisle, clutching her purse tightly. My father's head snapped toward her, his expression tightening, his jaw locked in fury. The judge paused as she approached. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "are you here to testify?" My mother nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." I need to speak." My father's attorney immediately objected, claiming her testimony was emotionally compromised. But the judge waved him off. "She's the mother of the plaintiff," she said firmly. "She has the right to speak." My mother stepped onto the witness stand, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with every word. "I've spent years living in fear," she began. "Fear of my husband, fear of losing my son, fear of what would happen if the truth came out. But I can't live that way anymore." She turned her gaze toward the judge, then toward the sea of faces staring at her. "Arthur Caldwell forced me to lie. He told me to say our son was his. He threatened to ruin Mark Reynolds' life if I didn't. He made me destroy every letter, every photograph, every trace of the truth." The courtroom went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the rustle of papers, the quiet gasp of someone in the back row. My father's lawyer shouted, "Objection!" But the judge's gavel struck the bench like thunder. "Overruled," she said. My mother looked straight at my father. "You took everything from me, from us, but you don't get to take the truth anymore." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "He's not your son." The judge raised her hand for silence, but there was none to be found. Reporters jumped to their feet. Cameras clicked furiously. The words hung in the air like a live wire, impossible to contain. I turned to look at my father. His face, usually unreadable, was pale with rage. For the first time in my life, I saw him afraid, not of losing money or power, but of losing control. His empire was crumbling in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For a long, suspended second, the entire world seemed to freeze. The lies, the years, the silence, everything collapsing into this single, irreversible moment. And that's when I stood, turned toward the man who had been erased from my life, and pointed at him. And that's when I stood, pointed at Mark, and said the words that froze the room. Some truths echo louder than any gavel. The instant the words left my mouth, the world seemed to stop. "That's my real dad." It was as if the sound carried its own force, echoing off the marble walls, bouncing between the reporters, the jury, and the judge's bench until it filled every corner of the courtroom. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but silence. A silence so dense it pressed against my skin. And then the explosion came. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters stumbled over one another as cameras began flashing in a frenzy. The judge's gavel slammed down again and again, but no one was listening. My father's attorneys shouted objections, their voices swallowed by the noise. The moment I had spent my whole life unknowingly moving toward had arrived, and I had detonated it myself. Mark sat frozen at the witness stand, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his eyes glistening with disbelief. He hadn't expected it, neither had I. The words had come out raw and unplanned, born from something deeper than logic or strategy. It wasn't a declaration for the court. It was a truth my soul had been waiting to say for 26 years. Across the aisle, my father, Arthur Caldwell, didn't move. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and for the first time since I could remember, his composure cracked. The man who had taught me that control was power, that emotion was weakness, now sat powerless before me. The weight of his empire, his lies, and his arrogance was crushing him, and all he could do was sit there while the truth undid him piece by piece. The judge called for silence once more, her gavel striking the wood with sharp finality. "Order!" she shouted. The courtroom fell into uneasy quiet. My lawyer, Clara, stood and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, my client has simply stated what this case has proven through evidence, testimony, and DNA. The truth cannot be silenced any longer." The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable as she shuffled through the case documents. Time stretched thin, every second feeling like an hour. I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that hums before lightning strikes. Finally, she spoke. After reviewing the evidence presented, including certified genetic testing and sworn testimony from Mrs. Caldwell, this court acknowledges the biological and legal identity of the plaintiff. She paused, her gaze flicking between me, my father, and Mark. We hereby recognize Mr. Mark Reynolds as the biological father of the plaintiff. It was official. Just like that, 26 years of deception collapsed under the weight of a few carefully spoken sentences. The courtroom erupted again, not with chaos this time, but with something like disbelief. Some people gasped, some cheered quietly, others sat stunned, whispering to one another as if they'd witnessed something biblical. My father's face went pale. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor like a scream. His lawyer whispered frantically, but Arthur ignored him. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his shoulders stiff, his head low. The cameras followed him, the great billionaire now reduced to a broken figure, retreating under the same spotlight that had once crowned him king. Mark remained seated, still in shock, until I approached him. His eyes searched mine, uncertain, afraid that this was all a dream that could disappear at any second. And maybe part of me feared that too. But when I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, I saw it, the recognition, the relief, the overwhelming gratitude that can only come from a lifetime of longing finally answered. He whispered, "You didn't have to do that." "I did," I said. "It was time." For a long moment we just sat there. Two men connected by blood and by years of silence. The past couldn't be rewritten, but at least now it could be acknowledged. As we left the courtroom, the hallway outside was chaos. Reporters swarmed from every direction, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in our faces. How does it feel to win? Will you pursue your inheritance? What happens now? Their questions blurred into white noise. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a headline or a pawn in my father's world. I felt real. I wasn't someone's son by convenience or strategy. I was someone's son by truth. My mother met us at the doors, tears streaking down her cheeks, but there was peace in her eyes, the kind of peace that comes only when you've finally stopped running. She reached out, touching Mark's arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." He nodded softly. No resentment in his face, only understanding. The three of us stood there for a few seconds, not as a broken family, but as one being rebuilt. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with media. My lawyer guided us through the crowd, her hand on my shoulder whispering, "Keep walking, don't say anything." But even if I wanted to, I couldn't. My voice wouldn't have survived it. The adrenaline had burned through, leaving behind something deeper, exhaustion mixed with freedom. When we finally made it to the car, Mark turned to me and said, almost shyly, "I don't know what comes next." I smiled faintly, though my chest still ached. Neither do I. But as we pulled away from the courthouse, the cameras still flashing behind us, I realized that the trial might have ended. But the story wasn't over. The verdict wasn't a finish line. It was a beginning. A doorway into a life I had never known how to live. For the first time, the silence in my mind wasn't suffocating. It was peace. But peace has a way of being temporary when your enemy still has power. Somewhere out there, my father was regrouping, plotting, rebuilding. I knew him too well to believe he'd stay silent forever. The road ahead was uncertain. And yet I wasn't afraid anymore. I had lost almost everything, my wealth, my name, my status. But I had gained something he could never buy back, the truth. Still, as the courthouse faded behind us, something in me whispered that this wasn't the end. It felt like the calm between two storms, the moment the air stills just before the next wave hits. But the story didn't end with the verdict. It began after it. The truth set me free. But freedom came at a price. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the noise began to fade. The cameras stopped flashing. The reporters found new scandals to chase. and the story that had once consumed every headline slowly disappeared from the front page. But while the world moved on, I was left standing in the wreckage, pieces of my life scattered around me, some worth saving, others better left buried. The mansion I grew up in was now just another property under investigation. The gates that once symbolized power now looked like prison bars. My mother left the house first. She packed what little she needed, a few photographs, her wedding ring, and a stack of therapy pamphlets. She told me she couldn't stay in the place where she'd spent so many years living under someone else's rules. Watching her leave was harder than I expected. For so long, I'd seen her as fragile, trapped. But as she walked down that long marble hallway with her head high, I realized she was finally free. Mark and I spent those early days fumbling through the delicate process of rebuilding something that had never been built in the first place. He wasn't a father in the way I'd known. There were no rules, no expectations, no power plays. We started small. Coffee on Sundays, conversations that stretched into awkward silences, learning each other's rhythms. I discovered he loved old blues records and burned his toast every morning. He learned that I couldn't fall asleep without noise in the background, a habit born from growing up in a house where silence meant danger. Sometimes we sat in quiet understanding, saying nothing at all. Other times, he'd look at me with that half smile and say, "You've got your mother's eyes." And every time he said it, something in me healed a little more. We weren't perfect. We didn't need to be. What mattered was that for the first time, I wasn't pretending. The billionaire's empire, my former father's, began to crumble almost immediately. Board members resigned, investors fled, and lawsuits poured in. The press uncovered years of shady deals, falsified records, and silenced employees. His reputation went from that of an untouchable mogul to a cautionary tale about power and deceit. I didn't gloat when I saw the news. I just felt tired. Watching him fall didn't bring me joy. It brought me closure. He had built his empire by controlling everyone around him, and when the truth finally broke free, it took everything he owned with it. One afternoon, my lawyer called to tell me that I was still legally entitled to a significant portion of his estate, the inheritance he'd once used as a leash. I didn't even let her finish before I said no. I didn't want a cent of it. Every dollar in that fortune was stained with manipulation, pain, and silence. Taking it would have been like putting the chains back on. Instead, I sold my car, closed the accounts tied to his company, and moved into a small apartment downtown. Nothing fancy, just mine. I found work helping an advocacy group that supported children separated from their families through corruption and manipulation. It felt poetic in a way, using the chaos of my past to keep others from living the same nightmare. At night, I slept without fear for the first time in my life. No security guards patrolling the halls, no tension simmering behind locked doors. Just quiet. Honest, peaceful quiet. It was strange at first. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural after a lifetime of noise. But as the days passed, I began to love it. My mother and I talked often. Therapy was helping her piece herself back together, to find the version of herself she'd buried under years of control. Sometimes she cried when we spoke, apologizing again and again for the years of silence. But I told her what I truly believed, that the silence wasn't her fault. The lie had been his, and she'd done what she thought she needed to survive. Forgiveness came easier than I expected. Maybe because, for the first time, I was capable of giving it. Mark, too, was changing. I could see the light returning to his face each time we met. He'd spent 2 decades living in the shadow of someone else's lie, and now, like me, he was learning how to exist outside it. Sometimes, when we talked about the past, his voice would catch. "I used to walk by that mansion sometimes," he admitted once. "I'd look at those gates and wonder if you were happy in there, if you even knew I existed." He smiled sadly. "Guess I have my answer now?" I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Some wounds are too deep for words, but acknowledgement, that simple act of saying I see you, can be its own kind of healing. For a while, everything felt almost normal. My days were quiet. My nights were mine. The noise of the past had faded to a distant hum. I'd stopped checking the news for mentions of my father. He'd gone silent since the trial, withdrawing from the public eye completely. Some said he'd left the country. Others claimed he was hiding under a new identity. I didn't care. I told myself that part of my life was finally over. But peace has a way of making you forget that stories like mine don't end cleanly. It was a gray morning in late October when the letter arrived. I almost threw it away. It was plain white, no logo, no stamp from any company, just my name, handwritten in block letters. No return address. My stomach tightened as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. No signature, no explanation. Just one sentence typed neatly in the center of the page. You think you know the whole story. You don't. I read it twice, then a third time. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was suffocating. My pulse quickened, my chest tightening with a familiar dread I thought I'd outgrown. I turned the envelope over, searching for clues. Nothing. Just blank paper, as empty as the silence that followed. For a long while, I sat there staring at it, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a cruel prank from someone who had read too much about my case. But something in my gut told me otherwise. The phrasing, the tone, the confidence behind those 8 words. It felt like him. Arthur Caldwell. I hadn't heard his voice in months, but I could still remember how he spoke. Slow, deliberate, every word calculated to pierce where it hurt most. And this letter, short and precise, carried that same rhythm, that same control. My hands trembled as I folded the letter back into the envelope. I looked around my apartment, at the life I had built from the ruins, and realized that peace had been an illusion, a fragile pause between truths. The war wasn't over. The truth had freed me, yes, but freedom has a cost, and I was about to pay it. And that's when I realized the lies weren't over. If you were in my place, would you have done the same? Would you choose truth over comfort, even if it meant losing everything? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more stories where truth costs everything, hit that subscribe button.